Hello and welcome back to the Photography Made Simple podcast. In this week's episode, we're chatting about how you can take beautiful studio style portraits at home. I'm going to share with you how you can set up a very simple, inexpensive home studio using nothing more than natural light and maybe one or two backdrops. So let's go ahead and dive straight in. Hey there, I'm Audrey-Anne, founder of Live Snap Love, and I'm on a mission to help photographers just like you grow their photography skills quickly and in a way that feels simple and easy so you can shorten the learning curve and get photos you love faster. I created this Photography Made Simple podcast to share simple, actionable techniques, helpful insights, and practical advice on all things photography. So if you're itching to take your photos to the next level, whatever that level may be, you're in the perfect place. So let's get started. So as much as I love natural, candid, documentary and lifestyle photos, my other love is posed portrait photography. Now, I do love the great outdoors for this a lot of the time, but sometimes the weather just doesn't work for me, particularly here in Scotland when it can be dark and rainy and quite frankly too bloody cold to stand outside shooting for any length of time. And for me, that's when having a simple photography studio at home can make all the difference. It gives me somewhere to take photos when the weather just isn't exactly playing ball and something that I would have wished for. But there's also something really powerful about a simple studio portrait. It allows the focus to be completely on the person. You are in complete control of things like lighting and positioning. Plus, you can get really inventive with different backdrops or props that you use. So it really does allow you to get creative in an entirely different way. So I love studio portraits for that reason, not just because it's cold and rainy outside, for example, but also because I love the look of that simple studio portrait as well. But of course, we don't all have the luxury of having a studio space or, for that matter, studio lighting. But that doesn't mean that you can't take beautiful studio portraits at home and in a lot of cases using only what you have or setting one up that is relatively inexpensive. I bought everything I need for the studio style photos I take for, I think it was around $200, which is a while ago now. I think that's pretty good and it works perfectly for me. Obviously, you can go much, much higher end than this. And if you are planning on setting one up that you can use continuously, you'll probably want to spend more money than that. So the price can go from completely free to literally thousands of dollars. We won't be going into the higher end stuff in this particular podcast episode, but if you ever want to upgrade at any point, you'll know that you have the option there. Because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk you through how to take studio portraits at home using what you have or cheap and cheerful equipment. Now, I am going to link to the different options for things that I mention in this episode in the show notes. Now, you'll find everything at livesnaplove.com/12, and you'll find a link to that show notes around about where you are listening to this podcast. So let's go ahead and dive in with the first thing you need to consider when setting up your home studio for studio style portraits, and that is the light source we are going to use. Now, light has to be the first thing that we look at because it is arguably the most important element of getting beautiful studio portraits. It doesn't matter how gorgeous your subject is, what beautiful backdrop you use, what lens you have on your camera. If the light isn't good, then you're going to have bad photos. Now, this is true with all different genres of photography, not just studio portraits. Remember, bad light is one of the things you really can't fix in editing, so it's important to get this right from the get-go. So the light we will all have available is natural light. So for your simple home studio, you need to find a room or area that has a lot of natural light available. So the first option is to choose a room that has a large window. Any large window will do, but a patio door where you have floor to ceiling light is ideal. That's my preference when shooting indoors, and the only room in my house that has that at least is big enough, is my living room, so I tend to set it up in there. But your natural light at home studio doesn't have to be in a room in your house. I often actually set mine up out in the garage. It has beautiful natural light because of that large open doorway, plenty of space, or at least it does after I turf my husband's motorbikes out onto the street, and I can hide any clutter there with the backdrop that I use. So for me, I either use my living room or the garage depending on how I'm feeling that day. But another option is to use a doorway with natural light. For example, your front door. Simply open up the door and you can use that as your light source. Now, I'm not going to talk about dedicated studio lighting in this guide because that's a whole different ballgame. That's when you get into alien bees and diffusers and so on. But if you feel like you might need a little bit more light, then you also have the option of supplementing the natural light with a speed light. Now, I don't often do this, but it can be nice to have there as a backup and a safety net. Plus, I use my speed light for other things, so it's a useful tool for me to have anyway. The other thing you might want when it comes to lighting is a large reflector. The size of this will depend on the subject, but you will want this as large as, or ideally larger than your subject. So if you're only planning on doing headshots, you can get away with a smaller one. If you're going full body, you're going to need a pretty big one. So it really depends on what you intend to use your home studio for. I will link to some speedlight and reflector options in the show notes. Remember, you can get that at livesnaplove.com/12. The next step is to decide where to set up your studio. Now, this might actually be just completely linked to where the natural light is, but there are a few other things to consider for choosing your location. So if you have 3 or 4 places you can use with that natural light, the next thing we want to do is consider the size of the room and the setup. So the first thing to bear in mind is that we generally don't want to have the light hitting our subject from the front. That's flat light and it can lead to portraits that are a little bit bland and uninteresting. Can be really useful for some types of portraits if you really want to smooth out the skin, for example, but for most, we want to have the light source at an angle. So around 45 to 90 degrees is where you're going to place your subject. Now, this will give you a really nice, soft, flattering light on your subject. Now, the second thing you're going to want is to have enough space to be able to leave some space between the subject and the backdrop and between you and the subject. So we are needing to have space all around us there, really. We need to have the backdrop, pull your subject away from that backdrop, and then you're going to need to be a little bit further back or you're going to end up distorting the features. So this means you're going to need a location where there is a little bit more room for you to work in as well. So I find when shooting indoors that I need to stick to just headshots or half body shots rather than anything that shows the full body, unless they're really little, because our rooms aren't particularly large and I can't get that amount of space that I need in any of my rooms. The garage is the only place that I can kind of do that. Even then, though that can be quite tricky, it's still not the largest of spaces. So that is something to bearing in mind. So in addition to considering the light source in the room, make sure you have enough room to set everything up. Okay, moving on now. So we have our location, which is going to be big enough to set everything up in, and it's going to have beautiful, soft, natural light coming in. So we again make sure that is a large window or a patio door or the garage or something. So the next thing you need to do is get a good backdrop for your subject. Now, if you're shooting in a room indoors, then really all you're going to need is a blank wall. Just take any paintings or framed pictures off the wall, remove anything, from the shelves or units. If you have any plant pots or ornaments, we want to keep the area behind your subject clutter-free and only including what we want to show. So if you have a location that is big enough, it has a natural light, and you can create a blank wall, fantastic, you are good to go. But for most of us, it can be difficult to find a blank wall right behind where you should place your subject. So for me, we have a very large television in the middle of the room. It ends up being in the frame whenever I try and sort of angle my subject in order to get enough room in the frame. So I pretty much always have to use a backdrop. So this is where you will want to use a portable backdrop, which will create that blank wall behind your subject wherever you want it. Now you have several options here. Again, these range all the way from the free right the way to the super expensive. So as always, let's start with the zero cost options. So the first thing you can use is a bed sheet. Now, I'll tell you right now, don't use a fitted sheet, that has the elastic bands at the corners for fitting under your mattress. You want a flat bed sheet. But it's up to you if these can be plain, they can be different colors, they can be patterned, whatever you have or whatever works for you. They can sometimes be a little thin, especially the white ones. So maybe doubling up on these for your backdrop is a good idea, but see what your sheets are like. On the plus side for these, they are really inexpensive and probably something that you already have kicking about. But remember, it doesn't have to be a bed sheet. It could also be things like quilt covers, a bedspread, blankets, something else that's that larger size you could fit over a bed. And ideally is either a sort of plain, non-distracting pattern or, has no pattern at all. Now, if you are using a bed sheet, the one thing to be really aware of is that it will crease and those creases will show and then it looks like a bed sheet. So make sure that you iron it to get rid of any creases and that it's big enough for your intended purposes. So if you have a handheld steamer, once you've placed the backdrop in position, use that handheld steamer to get rid of any creases. I don't have one. It's next on my wish list. So I just need to find a way of sneaking that in past my husband. So next thing is paid options. So you can get rolls of vinyl and these come in all sorts of patterns. You can get marble effect, you can get wood grain effect, you can have it look like a brick wall, you get floral patterns, and you get plain ones too. So you get really a lot of different options here and they're relatively inexpensive. You can also get muslin backdrops. I've never used these. I would guess that's kind of similar to using a bed sheet. You'll need to make sure that you get all the creases out of it. Now, a slightly more expensive option, and the one I use, is a seamless paper backdrop. Now, these are just wide rolls of very, very sturdy paper. Think sort of like a mix between paper and sort of cardboard, really thick, sturdy paper. And they come in such a huge, wide variety of colors. You can get patterned ones as well, I think, but generally I just stick to the plain. And the reason I stick to a plain backdrop, by the way, is you can always add a pattern or texture in Photoshop, which helps you mix things up and change out the look each time. So I generally go for plain, and that way I can tweak it in post-processing if I want to get a little bit more fancy. I would also recommend that you get at least one in a neutral color that can be used for a wide variety of images. Now, my favorite is my gray one. It's Thunder Grey. And I like that one. It gives me that perfect kind. I can make it go completely black. I can lighten it a little. I can have it look grey. It's great for putting patterns on, and it works for children, teenagers, adults, works for everything. So I think that's the kind of, it's like the little black dress of your backdrop wardrobe. And if you have the funds, you can always go for a fun, quirky color one as well, or a pattern so you can mix things up. I got a white backdrop as my second one, and I wish I hadn't. It's just too plain. I'm not keen on it at all. So I wish I'd gone for a color. You might like the white one though, it's entirely up to you, but I find that I use grey as the neutral one, and then I would have loved a colour one as well. Now, one more thing is regarding the size. So you want to make sure that it is wide enough for your intended purpose. Now, when it comes to these backdrop rolls, they generally come in two different sizes, which is 53 inch and 107 inch, I think it is. I would recommend the 107-inch rolls. The 53-inch rolls are okay if you're working with a newborn or a single subject, or a very close pair of subjects that don't mind, really squishing together and staying still. I just really like the freedom that you get with the wider roll. So if you have the room, go for it. If you don't, the 53-inch is fine. And remember, you can extend the background as well in editing. So I will also link to some options for the studio backdrops in the show notes. Again, you'll find that at livesnaplove.com/12. But there are loads more than I am going to link to, so you can do some research and see which ones are suitable for you. Okay, moving on now. We have a location, we've got our light, we've got our backdrop. What we need now is something to hold up the backdrop. Again, these can range from the super cheap to the uber expensive, and it does also depend on the size of the backdrop. So the first cheap and cheerful option is simply to take your backdrop and pin it up on your wall. If the reason you didn't just use the wall behind your subject is it's, you didn't like the pattern that was there or something along those lines, you can simply pin up the backdrop. And that's one way of doing it. Another option, which is no cost, is to take 2 dining room chairs and then just drape the fabric or the paper roll over them. You can actually put a pole of some description, like a sweeping brush is what I used, between them if you feel that you need a bit more width than the chairs give you. Now, this will not work for portraits of full-size people. I think it will only work really for newborns or very little people. It's not going to be suitable for me unless you can find some way of raising that. It doesn't really work for many things. The next option is to do what I did, and that is buy a super cheap set of backdrop stands. Now, these come with 2 stands and a pole connecting the two that you thread the roll of backdrop paper. Or if you're using fabric, you just clip the fabric to that pole. So these are also really portable. You just simply fold them up and then pack them into a bag when not in use. Now, this is really important for me. I cannot leave a studio set up all the time. I set up, take the pictures that I'm planning on taking, and take it back down again. It's a little bit of a pain. My husband would just move out of the garage and give that to me as a studio. That would make all the difference. You can write to him no, I'm only joking. So being able to just take everything down and fit it into a bag and then just store it away is ideal for me. Now, the downside to these being so portable and therefore, let's face it, cheap, is that they are really flimsy. Would recommend that you weigh down the base of the stand with something. So I just tend to put some bags of something around that just to help weigh it down, because they're not the sturdiest. And if someone bangs into it, they're going to fall over. So it's not a deal breaker for me, but it is just something to be aware of. Again, if you're more serious about this, you can invest in a more sturdy set of backdrop stands. You can actually get ones where you can hold multiple rolls of paper at the same time. So it can hold like 3 rolls of paper, the backdrop paper, and then you just roll one down that you're using. And then, if you decide to change a different backdrop, you just roll that one back up and pull the other one down without having to dismantle everything. So again, it's a more professional option, more expensive, but it is something to be aware of, that if you do want to really invest in this, then you can get more sturdy. Just remember, more sturdy tends to be less portable. So again, I'll link to some cheap and cheerful stands plus a more expensive option in the show notes. Again, that's livesnaplove.com/12. Now, the final thing you need here is a set of pony clamps. You clamp these onto the top of the paper to stop it sliding down or to hold up your fabric. These are usually included in your stand kit, but I'll link to them anyway, just in case they aren't. Now, I have seen people manage to rig up DIY stands using bits of pipe, I think it was the one I saw. So there's definitely other DIY ways of doing this as well. For me, for the $30 it costs for the backdrop stand, I'll just go with that. It's all done. But, if you want something sturdier but don't want to spend the money, you can rig up these things yourself as well. Okay, so we're moving on. Again, just to recap, we have our lighting, and the location that we're shooting in. We know where we're going to place our subject. We've got our backdrop. We have that set up on a stand and clamped into place. There's one more thing that you need to think about, and that is the floating. Now, if you are going for headshots and half body shots only, which is what I do, you don't need to worry about this. That's it, job done, you're good to go. But for pictures where you want the full body, you're going to see the floating as well. So you're going to need to think about that too. Now, of course, if your floors are nice enough, you can just use that, job done. If not, the next option is to simply pull out the backdrop, and this is if you're using that backdrop paper, just pull it out even more so that it runs all the way from the back, hits the floor, and then runs along the floor. So you have this seamless wall to floor look. That's generally what I do if I need to create a flooring, or, I want to cover my existing floor. Again, I don't do that often, but when I do, so when I was in the garage, I just pulled that out. Again, if you're taking this more seriously, you can create a fake floor. So I've seen ones done which are brilliant. They use like wooden floors. So go to your local hardware store and get some sort of laminate flooring, such as the fake wood, and then you can clip them together. So most of the ones you get like that, they kind of clip all together and you've created a fake floor. If you want to get even fancier with that, you can lay that down on top of a large piece of plywood and then have them together, and that gives you a bit more stability. It just makes it sturdier. So it really depends on what you're doing that on top of. Again, it depends on how portable you want things to do. That's a large sheet of area to have kicking about. So I prefer anything that can just be easily dismantled. But again, it really depends on you. If you do go down the floating route and you are looking to include the floating in your shot, then one thing that you can do that just helps tidy the frame up a little is add a little bit of skirting board or baseboard to the bottom of the fabric or the paper. So when you hang your paper roll, you're going to have the paper roll meet the floating at some point. And what you can do is put that little piece of skirting board or baseboard, clamp that onto the paper where it hits the floor so that you have that little trim between the paper and the flooring. It just makes it look more like a room. Again, you just pick up a length of that from your local hardware store. You usually get them in white or wood, and then you can paint that any color you like. And that just helps create that neat transition where you don't see the roll of the paper at the bottom where it meets the floor. You see the paper, I'll just call it white skirting board or baseboard, and then your floating, and it gives you that little transition between the two. Moving on now to the final thing is props. So in order to make things a little bit more interesting or just mix it up a little bit, you can also bring in some props. These are totally optional. You definitely don't need to have them, but depending on what you are shooting and whether you want it to just keep it simple, really simple studio portrait, or you want to go more dramatic, you can add that in with your props. So at the very simple end, it could be just like a flower garland for your subject to wear, or you could bring in an old weather chair or an apple crate for your subject to sit on, or a soft fluffy rug, something that adds that texture. And then you can go all the way to the more stylized end, and you could add in fluffy white clouds and a moon or Valentine's Day heart balloons, or you can have a Christmas theme. I think you kind of get the idea here. You can really add in as many props as your backdrop will take, and depending on how simple or stylized you want it to be. So now that we have our location, we've got our natural light, we have our backdrop, we have everything fixed into place, and we have any props, we are ready to start shooting. So here are some tips for you for that. The first is, as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you pull your subject away from the background, ideally around 6 to 8 feet. And this is so you don't get shadows on the backdrop. Now, this does make shooting in the average size room in an average house very, very tight. If you have the room, fantastic. For me, we've got quite small rooms, so I always end up shooting with my subjects closer than they should be to the background, but I just have to make sure that I watch very carefully for undesirable shadows. So if you are tight for space, just, you can go in a little bit from that, but just watch you're not creating a shadow in the background. It also means, by doing this, that you might end up with less room. So you're going to have to shoot with a wider angle lens than you would normally. Now, I love my 135mm for outdoor portraits, but there's not a chance in hell of using this indoors. So I usually use my 50mm. But sometimes the 35 or the 85 make an appearance depending on whether I'm going for a headshot or more of a full body shot. So keep that in mind as well. You might need to use a wider angle. Now, the lens numbers I gave there, remember I'm shooting with a full frame. If you're shooting with a crop frame, remember that makes things even tighter, so you might even need to go for a wider angle than that. So there you have it, how to take studio portraits at home. We've spoken about how to use natural light by using a large window or an open door or patio doors or even in the garage. We've spoken about where to place your subject in relation to the light, ideally at a 45 to 90 degree angle. We've spoken about your backdrop. You can have a plain wall or you can buy cheap, inexpensive backdrops, and you'll need some kind of stand to hold that up. And remember to think about your flooring, whether to use the existing flooring that's there or not worry about it at all because you're going for a headshot. And finally, when you're shooting, make sure that you have your subject away from that backdrop. There's no shadow on the backdrop behind them, and that you're shooting with a lens that's going to allow you enough room to step back a little from your subject to make sure you don't get any distortion to the features. So remember also that you're going to find links to everything I mentioned here and probably some things that I'll remember now that we've finished recording. You'll find all of that at the show notes for this episode at livesnaplove.com/12. So I hope you've enjoyed hanging out with me again today, and maybe you feel inspired to create your own makeshift studio at home and take your own simple studio style portraits. I can't wait to see you again next week for more photography goodness. But until then, have a lovely week, and I'll see you again next week, same time, same place. Bye for now. So that wraps up this week's episode of Photography Made Simple. I'll be back at the same time, same place next week. But if you want more, head on over to livesnaplove.com/podcast, where you can find all the resources and the downloads mentioned, plus a whole lot more. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to subscribe, and that way you won't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again next week.